Welcome back to, let's say, our final installment of the study on Mere Christianity. This week is going to be a little bit longer. We only have 2 chapters, but there's some things I want to say at the end. Last week, we finished off with the idea that God's goal is making you perfect. Not just making you a good person, not even making you a saint, but making you literally perfect. And Lewis says it's important to recognize this, or else you might start resisting. You might start thinking you're good enough. And so you have to recognize at the outset, the goal is absolute perfection. Now that leads us right into chapter 10, Nice People or New Men, which starts out with a question that we've all heard some variety of, and Lewis puts it like this. If Christianity is true, then why isn't that all Christians aren't nicer people than not Christians? Right? If Christianity is making people perfect, then why aren't all the Christians obviously nicer than not Christians? Well, Lewis says there's 2 parts to this question, one that's reasonable and one that's not. The reasonable part of the question is this. If someone is not a Christian and they are converted to Christianity, but that conversion imparts no improvement, he says if they're just as snobbish or spiteful or envious or ambitious as before, he says, I would suspect that their conversion was largely imaginary. Every time you think you make an advancement, the next job is to test it. Lewis says, fine feelings, new insights, greater interest in religion mean nothing unless they make our actual behavior better. Just as in an illness, feeling better is not much good if the thermometer shows that your temperature is still going up. In that sense, the outer world is quite right to judge Christianity by its results. Christ told us to judge by results. A tree is known by the fruit it bears. When we Christians behave badly, we are making Christianity unbelievable to the outside world. The wartime posters told us that careless talk costs lives. In World War II, they had posters that said, careless talk costs lives, meaning, be careful who you talk to, and about what. You don't know who's a spy, and if the wrong information gets out, that could kill soldiers. Careless talk costs lives. It is equally true that careless lives cost talk. Our careless lives set the outer world talking, and we give them grounds for talking in a way that throws doubt on the truth of Christianity itself. But this brings us up to the unreasonable part of the question. The question is, why aren't all Christians obviously nicer than non-Christians? Well, the person asking this question is implicitly dividing the world into 2 camps. You have Christians and not Christians. And then they're asking that all the people in the first camp be nicer than all the people in the second camp. Now, this is unreasonable on several grounds. First, the real world is much more complicated than that. You don't have 2 distinct camps. In the real world, people are constantly moving from one camp to the other as people lose their faith or other people find God. And it's not even very drastic or sudden. It's usually a gradual process. So it's really no good comparing people en masse. Secondly, we might not be asking quite the right question. Let's start with the assumption that Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, then these 2 conclusions follow, and they're kind of the same idea flip-flopped. 1, any Christian would be nicer than if they were not a Christian. And 2, anyone who becomes a Christian is now nicer than they were before. Right? That's kind of the same idea repeated twice. If you're a Christian, you're nicer than you would be if you're not a Christian. If you're not a Christian, you become a Christian, you should be nicer. Now, I did it vertically. So, in my mind, I do it vertically. It's like you can compare yourself to yourself. The problem comes when you compare yourself to other people, which is what the person asking the question is doing. This is kind of complicated. So let's throw out some hypothetical people to maybe make this easier. Let's make up a hypothetical Christian and name her Edith. Now, Edith has a very sharp tongue and unkind wit. She could be much more unkind than atheist Sam over here. But this tells us nothing. The question is, how much more unkind would Edith be if she were not a Christian? And how much more kind Sam would be if he was? Edith and Sam have different temperaments, based on their upbringing and their digestion. Christianity claims to put both temperaments under new management. The real question is, does that management improve them? We can all agree what's being managed in Sam's case is much nicer than what's being managed in Edith's case. Considering Edith's temperament, it's a wonder we get anything nice out of her at all. Looking at Sam's temperament, despite how kind he is, he should really be much kinder. He's not using his full potential, and she has no end of hindrances. Let's go a little deeper. Before Christ is done with her, Edith will be very nice indeed. But that just sounds like Edith needs to get up to Sam's level, as if he's all right, as if he's good enough. It's as if Christianity is something that nasty people need, but nice people can do without. As if niceness was the only thing God cared about. But we know Sam needs saving just as much as Edith. You see, you cannot expect God to look at Sam's placid temper and friendly disposition exactly as we do. They result from natural causes which God himself creates. Being merely temperamental, they will all disappear if Sam's digestion alters. The niceness, in fact, is God's gift to Sam, not Sam's gift to God. In the same way, God has allowed natural causes, working in a world spoiled by centuries of sin, to produce in Edith the narrow mind and jangled nerves which account for most of her nastiness. He intends, in his own good time, to set that part of her right. But that is not, for God, the critical part of the business. It presents no difficulties. It is not what he is anxious about. What he is watching and waiting and working for is something that is not easy even for God, because, from the nature of the case, even he cannot produce it by a mere act of power. He is waiting and watching for it both in Sam and in Edith. It is something they can freely give him or freely refuse him. Will they, or will they not, turn to him, and thus fulfill the only purpose for which they were created? Their free will is trembling inside them like the needle of a compass. But this is a needle that can choose. It can point to its true north, but it need not. Will the needle swing round and settle and point to God? He can help it to do so. He cannot force it. He cannot, so to speak, put out his own hand and pull it into the right position, for then it would not be free will anymore. Will it point north? That is the question on which it all hangs. Will Edith and Sam offer their natures to God? The question, whether the natures they offer are nice or nasty ones, is of secondary importance. God can see to that part of the problem. You see, God sees a nice nature, a good temperament, as a good thing, in the same way that he sees things like bread and water and sunshine as good things. That is, they are good things in the sense that he gives them and we receive. He made Sam's nice nature, and there's plenty more where that came from. It cost God nothing, so far as we know, to make nice things. But to convert rebellious wills cost his crucifixion. Because Sam's niceness is a part of nature, it will all go to pieces when nature does. In that sense, it's rather like a sunset. It's beautiful, all right, but it lasts for just a moment. God has the power to take that moment and turn it into an eternal spirit. But Sam has not let him. And that brings us up to a paradox. So long as Sam doesn't turn to God, so long as he thinks his niceness is his own doing, it's not. It's just the result of nature acting through him. But the moment Sam recognizes that it is a gift from God, and offers it back, well, it's just then that it really does become his own. The only things we can keep are the things we freely give to God. What we try to keep to ourselves, what we are sure to lose. I'll warn you, I'm going to read for a bit here. We must, therefore, not be surprised if we find among the Christians some people who are still nasty. There is even, when you come to think it over, a reason why nasty people might be expected to turn to Christ in greater numbers than nice ones. That was what people objected to about Christ during his life on earth. He seemed to attract such awful people, tax collectors and prostitutes and so forth. That is what people still object to and always will. Do you not see why? Christ said, "Blessed are the poor," and "how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom." And no doubt he primarily meant the economically rich and economically poor. But do not his words also apply to another kind of riches or poverty? If you have sound nerves and intelligence and health and popularity and good upbringing, you are likely to be quite satisfied with your character as it is. Why drag God into it, you may ask? A certain level of good conduct comes fairly easily to you. You are not one of those wretched creatures who's always being tripped up by sex, or dipsomania, or nervousness, or bad temper. Everyone says you are a nice chap, and, between ourselves, you agree with them. You are quite likely to believe that all this niceness is your own doing, and you may easily not feel the need for any better kind of goodness. It is very different for the nasty people. The little, low, timid, warped, thin-blooded, lonely people, or the passionate, sensual, unbalanced people. If they make any attempt at goodness at all, they learn in double quick time that they need help. It is Christ or nothing for them. It is taking up the cross and following, or else despair. They are the lost sheep. He came especially to find them. They are, in one very real and terrible sense, the poor. He blessed them. They are the awful set he goes about with. And of course, the Pharisees still say, as they said from the first, if there was anything in Christianity, those people would not be Christians. There is either a warning or an encouragement here for every one of us. If you are a nice person, if virtue comes easily to you, beware. Much is expected from those to whom much is given. If you mistake for your own merits what are really God's gifts to you through nature, you are still a rebel, and all those gifts will only make your fall more terrible. But if you are a poor creature, poisoned by wretched upbringing in some house full of jealousies and quarrels, saddled by no choice of your own with some loathsome perversion, nagged day in and day out by an inferiority complex that makes you snap at your friends, do not despair. He knows all about it. You are one of the poor who he blessed. He knows what a wretched machine you are trying to drive. Keep on. Do what you can. One day, perhaps in another world, but perhaps far sooner than that, he will fling it on the scrap heap and give you a new one. And then you may astonish us all, not least yourself, for you have learned your driving in a hard school. Some of the last will be first, and some of the first will be last. I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit. Mere improvement is not redemption, though redemption always improves people even here and now, and will, in the end, improve them to a degree we cannot yet imagine. God became man to turn creatures into sons, not simply to produce better men of the old kind, but to produce a new kind of man. It is not like teaching a horse to jump better and better, but like turning a horse into a winged creature. Of course, once the horse has got its wings, it will soar over fences which could never have been jumped, and thus beat the natural horse at its own game. Or perhaps we've already spent too long on this question. That was Chapter 10, Nice People or New Men. That leads us into Chapter 11, the new men. Now, the last chapter we finished with the analogy of turning a horse into a creature with wings, because Lewis wanted to emphasize that it's not just improvement. It's not a horse getting better and better at jumping, but transformation, something totally new. The nearest parallel we have in nature is the metamorphosis we see in some insects. Now, I'm going to spoil the rest of the next chunk of the chapter, because we're going to talk about evolution. Now, I don't know what Lewis's personal view on evolution was, and I think it's possible it may have even changed throughout his life. He begins this section off by saying, everyone now knows about evolution, though, of course, some educated people disbelieve it. I won't pretend to know if that's him saying some educated people disbelieve it, wink, wink, or if that's him saying, or rather him conceding, like, even though we all know about evolution, there is debate on the matter. I will say that in one of his other works, I think it's Miracles, but I could be wrong, he talks about it rather matter-of-factly. And the only other reference I could find to evolution in anything by him, I had to do a Google search, was a letter that I don't have access to. I don't know. And so I'm having to trust the person who Googled it. And Lewis made the claim that he says something along the lines of, I have a soul, but I don't know what my soul was like before I was born. He says, I don't have to have an opinion on, let's say, the prenatal state of my soul. What's important is that I have a soul now, obviously. He says, in the same way, I don't think I really have to have an opinion on, let's say, the prenatal state of humanity. He says, what's important is that there are people now. That's what I'm concerned with. So, that's what I wanted to say about that. Lewis begins by saying, a real common question that modern people have is, what's the next step in evolution? Well, usually when people try to answer this question, what they end up with is people, but a good deal nastier than they are now. It says, well, people are smart, so we tend to think of the next step as people being smarter, and then you throw on like an extra arm or fangs or something. He says, here's the thing. Long ago, the world was covered in huge armored creatures that were very strong. And if you had to make a guess, you probably would have guessed that the creatures would have kept getting stronger, bigger, with more armor. But that's not what happened. Nature had a trick up her sleeve. She introduced little, naked, unarmored animals with better brains. And they took over the world. Lewis says, I think it's the same sort of mistake here to think that people are just going to keep getting smarter and smarter. That's thinking that people are going to keep going the same way, not going in a new way. But you could hardly call it a new step unless it did go in a new way. A real new step would not be merely different, but a new kind of different. It would not merely be a new stage in evolution. A real new step would supersede evolution itself as the method of producing change. And finally, Lewis says, I suspect that when it happens, or if it happens, people wouldn't notice that it had. Well, in those terms, Christians think the thing has already happened. 2,000 years ago in Palestine, something really new happened. Not brainy people being brainier, but turning from creatures of God into sons of God. This differs from the old way in several ways. One, this new step comes from outside nature rather than within it. Two, it's not carried on through sex. Of course, in the theory of evolution, there was a time before sex when you had single-celled organisms. So it's not a tremendous surprise to find that there is a time after sex, or more accurately, when sex becomes obsolete as the main channel of development. 3. Before, you had no choice. Evolution was something that happened to you. But this new step is voluntary. Not in the sense that you could have chosen to take it, but you can refuse it. We can dig in our heels, so to speak. 4. Christ is not merely the first instance of a new man, but more accurately, he is the new man. He is the origin or center of this new life. He came into this universe and brought Zoe, the new life, with him. New to us, of course. Zoe, in its own right, has always existed. And he transmits it to us, not through heredity, but through what Lewis calls good infection, through us having a personal contact with him. Never forget, a real quick aside here, never forget that we are still... I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. The next thing, the next way that it's different is that it's happening at a very different speed. Christianity, when compared with evolution, is like a flash of lightning. Never forget that we are still the early Christians. The present wicked and wasteful divisions between us are, let us hope, a disease of infancy. We are still teething. The outer world, no doubt, thinks just the opposite. It thinks we are dying of old age. But it has thought that very often before. Again and again, it has thought Christianity was dying from persecutions from without and corruptions from within, by the rise of Islam, the rise of the physical sciences, the rise of the great anti-Christian revolutionary movements. But every time, the world has been disappointed. Its first disappointment was over the crucifixion. The man came to life again. In a sense, and I quite realize how frightfully unfair it must seem to them, that has been happening ever since. They keep on killing the thing that he started. And each time, just as they are patting down the earth on its grave, they suddenly hear that it is still alive and has even broken out in some new place. No wonder they hate us. Finally, this new way is different in that the stakes are higher. Before, if you resisted evolution, let's say, at most you lost a few years of this life. But now, the consequences are eternal. On this view, the thing has happened. The new step has been taken and is being taken. Already the new men are dotted here and there all over the earth. Some, as I have admitted, are still hardly recognizable, but others can be recognized. Every now and then, one meets them. Their very voices and faces are different from ours, stronger, quieter, happier, more radiant. They begin where most of us leave off. They are, I say, recognizable, but you must know what to look for. They will not be very like the idea of religious people, which you have formed from your general reading. They do not draw attention to themselves. You tend to think that you are being kind to them when they are really being kind to you. They love you more than other men do, but need you less. As a quick aside, we must get over wanting to be needed. In some goodish people, that is the hardest of all temptations to resist. They will usually seem to have a lot of time. You will wonder where it comes from. When you have recognized one of them, you will recognize the next one much more easily. And I strongly suspect, but how should I know, that they recognize one another immediately and infallibly across every barrier of color, sex, class, age, and even of creeds. In that way, to become holy is rather like joining a secret society. To put it at the very lowest, it must be great fun. Of course, Lewis says, I now want to guard against the possible misunderstanding. The way I've been describing them, you're not to think that all these new men are going to be exactly the same. So here's a couple of analogies that maybe help us understand. Imagine meeting a group of people who had only ever lived in the dark, and so you try to explain light to them. Well, they might conclude that since the same light is falling on all of us and reacting to us in the same way, i.e. reflecting off us, you might conclude that we would all look the same. But we know that's not right. Light brings out our differences. It's being in the dark where everyone looks the same. Another analogy that might help is imagine meaning a person who had never had salt. And so you give him a pinch of it, and he tries it, and it's really strong taste in his mouth. And then you tell him that in our country, all of our foods are flavored with salt. And he might conclude, well, then all your foods must taste the same, because the thing I just tried was so powerful. But we know that salt brings out the real taste in a food. It's something like that with Christ in us. The more we get what we now call ourselves out of the way and let him take us over, the more truly ourselves we become. There is so much of him that millions and millions of little Christs, all different, will still be too few to express him fully. He made them all. He invented, as an author invents characters in a novel, all the different men that you and I were intended to be. In that sense, our real selves are all waiting for us in him. At the beginning of this section, I said that there were personalities in God. I will go further now. There are no real personalities anywhere else. Until you have given yourself up to him, you will not have a real self. Sameness is to be found most among the natural men, not among those who have surrendered to Christ. How monotonously alike all the great tyrants and conquerors have been. How gloriously different are all the saints. Give up yourself, and you will find your real self. Lose your life, and you will save it. Submit to death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will really be yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him. And with him, everything else thrown in. The end. That, ladies and gentlemen, was Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Kind of read through at light speed and interpreted by Nate. Now, I thought long and hard about how I wanted to finish this series. I think the right thing to do would be to at least give my personal opinion on if you wanted to keep reading C.S. Lewis, where I recommend you should start next. Now, Mere Christianity, I personally lump in with The Great Divorce and the Screwtaped Letters as Lewis's trifecta. All three of these books came out of World War II, and I might say they're his three greatest works. At the very least, the three of them are all in the top 5. The Great Divorce has an unfortunate name. It's a reference to a philosopher named William Blake in the year 1800, wrote a book called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he basically espoused the idea that heaven and hell are the same place. All roads lead to God. Lewis, while having a lot of respect for Blake, disagreed and said, I think the marriage of heaven and hell is a bit premature. And if their wedding occurred, then their divorce is inevitable. So The Great Divorce is Lewis exploring how heaven and hell are different. Now, it's a novel, and the basic idea of it is that there's a bunch of damned souls in purgatory or hell. The book's a little, well, not vague, it's, how would you say, sophisticated in its definition of those two things. But you have some damned souls who get to go on a field trip up to, not quite heaven, but if heaven is a city on a hill, it's the garden at the base of the hill. You can't see heaven in the distance, but you can see the light of heaven, coming up over the hill. And so the book is, basically the whole body of this book is just the conversations that take place between these damned souls and the saved souls and angels that come out to meet them. Now, the thing that strikes, I'll be honest, it's my favorite book by Lewis, And the reason it is these conversations, and I know how ridiculous this sounds, they feel so real. And it's like, what are you talking about? These are damn people going on a field trip up to the garden in front of heaven. That's as fantastic as it gets. It's like, no, like the conversations that take place, it's like, I know that person. I know that person. It's like, those are conversations I've had. There's something so real about that book. The next book I highly recommend is the Screwtaped Letters. The Screwtaped Letters is a series of letters written theoretically from an elder demon to a junior demon. The elder demon has tempted and damned so many people that he got promoted, and he doesn't have to do that anymore. And he's offering advice to a junior demon who's working on his first, they call his patience. And so the whole book is told from the demon's point of view, and it's offering advice on how best to tempt or corrupt or manipulate people. And the reason I recommend this book, first, it's hard to read, not in the sense that it's hard to read, like you can easily fly through chapters. They're only 2 or 3 pages each. I found it hard to read because if you read like three or 4 chapters in one go, I started feeling sick. It really captures like how unpleasant it is to think about things in the demonic way. But the reason I recommend it is because when I read it as a high schooler, as a young adult, I would read it and go, oh, I recognize that. That happens in my head. Oh, it's not that I'm a sociopath or a sicko or I'm the worst person who ever lived. It's like, that's how they work. That's their, what's the phrase, modus operandi. That's their strategy. That's their method. Why? Because it works. There's a really old book called The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And in it he says, if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you can win every battle. I think that's kind of why I like this book so much, is it helps you understand how demons work and how they manipulate us. And if you understand that, it doesn't rob them of all their power, but it robs them of some of their power, because now you can say, oh, this is what is happening. And then you can ask the question, why? Why are they attacking me in this way right now? What's really going on? And usually I find that God has a good answer for that. Some other books I recommend are Miracles and The Problem with Pain. They're very similar to Mere Christianity. They're nonfiction, kind of Lewis espousing and exploring various Christian theological ideas. I personally really like Lewis's Space Trilogy. I wish it had a better name. It's basically, the idea is, if God had created other worlds like ours with sapient creatures with free will, but ours was the only one that was fallen, what would that be like? And so you get to visit one world that's older than Earth, and so they are living in a sort of Eden because they're not fallen, but they watched us fall. They got to witness the fall of Earth and the war in heaven that took place. Like, even though they're not fallen, it introduced tragedy to their world. Then in a later book, you get to go to a world that's newer than Earth. That's a brand new world, and you get to see a new Adam and Eve and the temptation of this new Eve. And once again, the conversation that takes place between the protagonist, who's a Christian, and Eve's tempter is just, I think, fascinating. The last book that I highly recommend is A Grief Observed. Now, this was not a book that was meant to be published. These were Lewis's notes or journal that he wrote after the death of his wife. It wasn't a book he wanted to publish. It was just him processing his grief. And a lot of the book is him praying to God. Sometimes it's him yelling at God. Sometimes it's him going back and saying, what was I thinking when I wrote that? It's very exposed. The word that came to mind was naked. It's very raw, emotional. And it would never have been published, except that several years later, Lewis showed it to a friend of his, and the friend was like, no, you have to publish this. Lewis was initially so embarrassed by it that it was published under a different name. And it wasn't until after Lewis died that it was re-released, this time with his name on it. And the really funny thing about this book is many people read it and said, wow, this is a great book. You know who would really like it? C.S. Lewis. And so he had dozens of copies of the book around his house as different people sent the book to him saying, this would really help you cope with the death of your wife. The next thing I want to say is, in all fairness, mostly because I know Ryan thinks I like C.S. Lewis too much, here are some books by Lewis I don't recommend you read next. The first is The Pilgrims Regress. The Pilgrims Regress is written very similar to The Pilgrim's Progress, in that the whole book is an allegory, and it's very Aesop's Fable-esque. The issue I have with it, it's not a big issue, but it was one of the first things Lewis wrote after becoming a Christian. And so I read through it, and I personally looked at it and said, like, oh, here's an idea that grew to become miracles. And here's an idea in the book that grew to become the problem with pain. And so all throughout the book, it's ideas that you find sprinkled throughout the rest of his works, but not yet fully fleshed out. It's like, what's the right way? It's like a preface to all his other works, but like nothing's really fleshed out all the way. So I think if you're going to read Lewis, it's like, if you wanted those ideas, you would just go read the book that actually does them well. I personally don't recommend The Abolition of Man. The Abolition of Man is usually lumped in with miracles and the problem with pain as his nonfiction good espousing of theology. I personally found it incredibly dry and almost textbook-like. It is kind of what we covered at the beginning of Mere Christianity. It's making a case for objective truth, for objective morality, for objective beauty. It's basically an attack on postmodernism and the idea that everything's subjective. It's Lewis very detailedly going in and saying, like, some things have to be real. Here's why, and here's what I think those things are. But like I said, if you read The Abolition of Man and you enjoy it, like, I'm happy for you. I wish I could enjoy it more, but it was just incredibly dry to me. The last book that I don't recommend is Till We Have Faces. And not because it's not good. Rather the opposite. It's an incredibly good book. Till We Have Faces is a retelling of a Greek myth. It's Lewis retelling the myth of Psyche and Cupid. And the reason I don't recommend it is because it's not overtly Christian. It's the last novel that Lewis wrote. And as far as I can tell, it's just him flexing his literary muscles. It's just him going, I want to write the best story I can. I'm not interested in, at this point in time, in teaching people anything. I'm not interested in trying to help people grapple with difficult ideas. It's just, I want to write something that makes the world more beautiful. And so you read it, and it all takes place in ancient Greece. There's nothing Christian about it. There's some Christian undertones. Like, if you've read other Lewis, you'll recognize, like, oh, he's hinting at this idea here or that idea there. But if this was the second book by Lewis you'd ever read after Mere Christianity, you'd probably say, like, what was that about? There wasn't anything Christian in that. So, those are the books I recommend and don't recommend. The last thing I wanted to say was this. We started this series, and I gave a brief summary of Lewis's life up till World War II. And I thought it would be appropriate to finish that story now. So, World War II hits. Lewis gives the speeches that become Mere Christianity. He writes the Screwtaped Letters and The Great Divorce. World War II ends, and he goes back to teaching full-time at Oxford. And the next major event in Lewis's life is he met Joy Gresham. Joy Gresham was an American author. It's kind of complicated. Very smart woman. 2 sons from a previous marriage. She had gotten divorced. Remember, in a time when divorce was a lot less common. And she read something by Lewis, I don't know what, and thought to herself, I have some things to say to this man. And so she wrote him a letter. And he wrote her back. Now, this wasn't uncommon. Lewis had lots of correspondences. So he wrote back and forth with Joy Gresham for several years. But she reached a point where she was really struggling to find work. So Lewis says, well, how about this? How about if you come to England and I can get you a job at Oxford? So she did. It's quite an offer, by the way. She's a smart cookie if she can get a job at Oxford, regardless of who you know. So she goes and is working at Oxford for several years with her 2 teenage boys. When, I don't know what happens, something political. America and England have a hissy fit at each other. For whatever reason, England cuts off a whole bunch of work visas, and Joy's going to have to go back to America. So Lewis says, all right, hear me out. What if we have a sham marriage? It's like, we'll go to the court and we'll get an official marriage, and you can stay in the country, but like, it won't be a wedding. Like, you live at your house, I'll live at mine. For all intents and purposes, it'll just be a sham marriage, right? Convenience, a marriage of convenience. You get to stay in the country. And so they did. And then, several years later, they fell in love. And actually had a real wedding with a preacher. 4 years after their initial wedding, Joy Gresham passed away due to cancer, leaving her 2 mostly grown-up boys to be raised by their stepfather. Lewis wrote A Grief Observed, and then on November 22nd, 1963, he passed away. It was the same day that JFK was assassinated. And so the death of this theological giant really flew under the radar of most people. Which, and this is just my opinion, I think is how Lewis probably would have wanted it. He was, as far as I can tell, he seemed like a very humble person. Now, when I was getting ready for this study, I was doing a whole bunch of research. I had been reading C.S. Lewis for the last 10 years, and so I've been studying him kind of unofficially for the last decade, but I was really pushing the limits of my knowledge and trying to find out anything I could to bring it into the study and make it relevant. And I found a guy named Douglas Gresham. This was one of Joy Gresham's boys. The other one, David, has since passed away, but Douglas is still around. He's pretty old, but as far as I can tell, he is the last person alive who really knew Lewis. There's people who did interviews with him or heard him speak once, but Douglas lived with him for years. Now, in one of the interviews with Douglas Gresham, he told this story. In the last year of Lewis's life, he was in fairly poor health. Not a surprise, it was the last year of his life. And his kidneys were failing, and that caused a heart attack, and Lewis fell into a coma. And they actually weren't expecting him to wake up from the coma, but the nurse goes in one day, and there he is, sitting up, asking for a cup of tea. So British, right? Of course, the nurse first has to do some medical stuff and tests, but eventually Douglas gets to go in and sits down with him drinking tea. And Lewis says, I think I know how Lazarus must have felt, and how disappointed he must have been that he had to come back. Douglas, I was so close. And I think that is the right way to end this series. I have loved doing this with you guys. It has been such a joy and honor to be able to do this. We went through this book at kind of really fast, and so we skipped over some stuff, and I highly recommend that anybody who's listening could dig deeper, because there's so much good stuff in this book. I hope to do this again. I would love to do another book by Lewis. I have no idea what book that would be or when I will have the chance to do that, but I've really enjoyed this. I've loved doing this with you guys. And For the last time, that's all I have to say about that.